Progress requires optimism and pessimism to coexist.
I remember hearing this story from Admiral Stockdale, who was the highest ranking POW in Vietnam. And he was talking, after he was released, he was talking about how some of the POWs behaved when they were in prison. And he said, do you know who did the worst as a POW? It was the optimists. Because the optimists would say, we're going to be home by Christmas. And then Christmas would come and go, and they were just crushed. They were just destroyed. And he said the people who did the best were like the rational optimists, as I would define it. It'd be people who would say, we're going to go home by Christmas. I'm sorry. They would say, we're going to go home eventually. This war is going to end, and you're going to see your wife again. But we're not going home by Christmas. No one's going home by Christmas. This is going to be a long war. That's who actually did the best. Like, they could take optimism and pessimism at the same time and put them together and be a rational optimist. Another great example of this in business is Bill Gates, who in the 1970s, when he started Microsoft, took the biggest optimistic swing any entrepreneur has ever taken. And by saying, like, there's going to be a computer on every desk in the world, like the craziest bold vision anyone's ever taken. At the same time, he managed Microsoft as conservatively as you possibly could in terms of like tons of cash on the balance sheet, no debt. He always said that he wanted enough cash in the bank so that Microsoft could make payroll for 1 year with no revenue. The most conservative way you can run a business. At the same time, he's taking this ridiculous swing for the fences. And I think there are so many other businesses that are just as good, if not better, at creating products than Microsoft might be. But they were managing the business with an equal level of optimism, of like leverage and debt, and they eventually just get wiped out. They run themselves over a cliff. So Gates could take massive optimism and crazy pessimism and be like, these things are going to coexist at the same time. And that's an analogy for how a lot of people do well over time. Like the pure optimist runs over a cliff. The pure pessimist never gets out of bed. The person who knows when each needs to come into play is who actually does well over time.
What's that Taleb thing about, like, I'm an authoritarian with my family, I'm a socialist with my community, I'm a communist with my village.
He says, at the federal level, I'm a libertarian. At the state level, I'm a Republican. At the local level, I'm a Democrat. And at the family level, I'm a socialist. It's such a brilliant, I think it's a great thing to say, like, as the size of something changes, what you expect out of it and your relationship with it also changes.
It's also, your nature must be able to adapt to the demands of the situation that you're in and the vertical that you're in. Okay, so a business is not just a thing, this amorphous thing. It's not just, Tesla doesn't just make cars and invent shit. It also has to make money and like pay payroll and be in compliance, and it deals with lawsuits and it does all of these other things. It's like, do you really want Elon steaming into the lawsuit department for the person that's just been run over by an autonomous car? Probably not. That's where you have different horses for different courses.
Yes.
Right? And this is, I suppose, the difficulty comes when you as an individual agent try to amalgamate all of this into one brain. You know, in an organization, you can specialize, you can chunk things down. You find the person that has the nature that you want. We want to be conservative in the accounting department, and we want to be creative in the advertising department. Yes,
totally.
Fantastic. Like, don't get those the other way around, or else you end up with boring ads and insane accounts.
Big trouble. And a huge problem with entrepreneurship is the assumption that because you can understand a technical product, that you know how to run the business of a technical product. It's pretty rare. So someone like Mark Zuckerberg is very rare. He had the technical chops to build Facebook, build it himself, and to run it today as $1 trillion company. That's very rare. It's way more common for you to be an entrepreneur who knows how to build a product. And then as soon as it scales, you're like, I don't know what I'm doing here. I need to call in the big boys who know what they're doing. I mean, a good example of that was Uber, where Travis, like, no one could have built Uber other than Travis Kalanick. His ability to take a risk, his willingness to just give the middle finger to the regulators was like, no one else was willing to do that. And once Uber became a big company, probably nobody was worse at running a company than Travis Kalanick, because that same attitude of like, fuck the regulators, we're just going to do our thing. Once Uber was $100 billion company, that's not the guy you want running the place. You can't play that game. But that's more common to have like a different, like the person who was right to run it at this size is not the person who's right to run it at this size.
I told you the story of Ben Francis last night, and I mentioned that Ben was founder CEO, stepped back as CEO, guy that used to run Puma or Reebok came in. Then Ben came in as like CBO or something, like something to do with brand or like some sort of consultant, stepped back, then came back in as CEO. And he said this thing on the podcast that really stuck with me. And he said, when your ambitions for the brand are bigger than your ambitions for yourself, that's when you'll become successful.
I like that.
That he was prepared to be like, hey, am I the best person for the job right now? Yes. Okay, let's 0 to 10 mil. Let's do that. Do I have the first idea about how to run a 20 million pound business? Not really. In comes the person from Reebok. We're now at a $3 billion business. Well, maybe it's actually, there's different challenges and it's useful for me to be back here. And he was just completely prepared to put his own ego to one side and say, what am I supposed to do? So that shows a person who is right at multiple different stages, but not right at all stages.
Yeah. I think there's an interesting alternative history in which Steve Jobs does not die in 2011 and keeps running Apple. What would Apple be today? Because the truth is, after he left and Tim Cook came in, Apple did great. Apple did phenomenal in terms of like units sold, like net income. Apple has absolutely thrived under Tim Cook. And I think you'd actually make the argument that around the time that Steve Jobs happened to die, what Apple, the company, actually needed was a Tim Cook. Because, and what they needed before that was Steve Jobs. Like in the early 2000s, you needed a crazy maniac like Steve Jobs to come in and be like, I got this crazy idea for new products and no one else is thinking of. That's what Apple needed. Once they came up with those products, what you needed was someone to come in and keep the trains moving on time, like Tim Cook. So there is a weird alternative history, and I'm totally making this up. It's anyone's guess. Steve Jobs doesn't die. He keeps running Apple. And
into the ground.
Yes. Yes. I actually don't think that's likely, but I think it's like a very real possibility that could have happened.
It depends what metric you want. Do you want to continue to have this sort of pioneering spirit? This person that's just out there doing crazy things and it's exciting and all the rest of it? Yeah. In the beginning.
Yes. My hot take I've shared with some people, and I say this tongue in cheek, I'm not actually making this bet. Within 5 years, Elon Musk will either be a trillionaire or bankrupt. And there's like 50-50 odds of either. That's my hot take. I don't actually take it that seriously. But he's the kind of person who is like completely incapable of slowing down. It's always just bigger bet, bigger bet, bigger bet, bigger bet. And eventually that usually catches up with people. But it's so fascinating to watch while he's doing it.
Yeah, it really is.